So that we're all on the same page and using the same language, let's review key terms and concepts as they apply to critical incident stress management. Let's start by getting an understanding of what is a critical incident. A critical incident is a powerful traumatic event that initiates the crisis response in an individual. Without critical incidents, we wouldn't need to be studying crisis intervention because we wouldn't have crisis reactions. In the world of crisis intervention, we have the kinds of events that we can call the terrible 10 sampling of critical incidents. For example, a line of duty death. This term is often referred to with police and fire, but it can also be used in a multitude of other areas. The suicide of a colleague, a serious line of duty injury, a disaster or multi-casualty incident, the killing or wounding of an innocent person, significant events that can occur involving children, prolonged incidents, especially with the loss of life. This can include ongoing disasters and other larger or medium scale sorts of incidents. Personally threatening situations. Events with excessive media interest. In the world of athletic training and sports medicine, we can see this when a high-profile athlete becomes injured or something happens that may cause questioning by the press. And any highly distressing event in the eyes of the individual who's been affected by that event. So what's a crisis? Well, a crisis is a state of heightened emotional arousal or emotional turmoil. You can get excited or emotionally aroused in a pleasant way, and you can get emotionally aroused in a way that would cause you to have a negative reaction. But it's really not what we consider to be a crisis in this line of work until we get emotional turmoil, where function and normal activities tend to break down. So in summary, a crisis is an acute emotional reaction to a powerful stimulus or a demand that takes the individual beyond his or her normal coping mechanisms. We want to remember when we're doing crisis intervention that we want to focus on the individual's response to a traumatic event or incident and not on that incident or event itself. We can kind of look at this as a left brain, right brain discussion. So in the pre-crisis situation, we see that even though the emotional side of our brain contributes to our reactions, our thoughts, and our decision making, a lot of what we do is controlled and determined by the thinking and reasoning and cognitive side of our brain. When exposed to a crisis, we see a reversal sometimes in the things that drive our thoughts. And when that happens, we can get into an emotional crisis, which can disrupt our normal coping mechanisms and ability to function. When we look at the type of crises to which people are exposed, we can categorize them into two general categories. Maturational crises are those that are associated with changes in your life stage, growing up, midlife crisis, aging, retirement, having to relocate because of a new job, etc. Situational crises are related to or produced by events like accidents, deaths, disaster, terrorist attacks, etc. The situational crises are often more intense and more acute and therefore can tend to elicit a stronger or more intense response. Dr. Gerald Kaplan was one of the early pioneers in discovering and identifying the factors related to crises and the response of individuals to crises. In summary, a crisis is a disruption to a person's state of psychological balance, and their coping mechanisms fail, resulting in distress, impairment, or dysfunction. And this definition helps us understand the difference between someone who's in critical incident stress and becoming impaired versus someone who has the ability to deal with a negative event or crisis in their life that does not push them to the point where their coping mechanisms fail. Let's take a look at what happens to individuals' performance after they've been exposed to a crisis. So before the crisis, the individual is probably having their regular life, having their normal coping mechanisms, etc. And then something happens. And at this point of impact, or the place when the crisis takes place, when the person responds to the crisis, we tend to see disorganization, loss of function, inability to cope. And so their emotional and psychological state deteriorates. The individual will then get to their level of disorganization as a result of response to the crisis. And through trial and error, the individual is going to attempt to find mechanisms or strategies to cope with the psychological impact of the crisis. When they find the one that works, we see that the individual can then return to some level of function. One important thing to understand is that you may not return to the level at which you were before the crisis took place. There is the potential that people can get stuck and not return back to their normal level of function, and they have a new normal, or sometimes through learning and through developing their coping mechanisms, the individual is actually better equipped to deal with a potential negative situation in the future, and sometimes because of that, their performance can improve. So what we see emotionally in an individual kind of looks like this. Here you are going down the street, having your life, doing a normal day, everything's cool, and bang, the crisis takes place, and you have a crisis response. So your emotions go through the roof. You have high anxiety, maybe nervousness, maybe a bunch of other physical and psychological responses that we'll cover in section 2. But what has to happen over time is that this high anxiety has to progress through a series of stages which are very similar to the grief response. We go through a denial phase. We go through anger, especially when a significant loss is involved. We have remorse, especially if the individual feels that they could have prevented something or if they have a feeling that they were part of a cause. You go through stages of grief. And then eventually, hopefully, the individual reconciles the situation and the response to the crisis and can then move forward. So it's important to understand that crisis and stress are related to each other. So when an individual has an emotional crisis, there's a state of mental and physical arousal, which we call stress. The type of emotional turmoil that follows is a result of a number of factors. But what we see here is a stimulus-response situation. So we want to look at stress as the stimulus, and then how the person responds and deals with the stress as the response. So we have basically two types. The pleasant stress, called eustress, which is things like, oh, I got a present, oh, somebody surprised me with a day off, I am having a birthday, I'm getting married. These are all pleasant, stressful situations. And then we have distress, which we interpret often as negative stressful situations or negative stimulus being placed on the individual. Now, the level of arousal, like I said, depends on a number of things: personality, experience, training, nature of the stress, etc. You can have stress when you don't have a crisis. Some days, just being in the athletic training facility at work, things may go on and the athletes or patients may rile you up a little, but it's not a crisis. So you can have stress when you don't have a crisis. But you can't have a crisis without some level of stress being placed upon people. In this course, in this situation, we're focused on critical incident stress. In other words, the emotional, cognitive, and physical reactions from exposure to a powerful stimulus that overwhelms your ability to cope with the situation. And this is going to obviously affect your abilities to function. So critical incident stress management and in this case, crisis intervention, deals with individuals who have critical incident stress. Now we'll go a little bit more into the details of the types of responses that individuals have, but what we want to remember is that it's a heightened, multi-dimensional response. So we can see any or all of the cognitive, physical, emotional, or behavioral arousals and changes that have occurred as a result of the individual's exposure to the crisis. What we want to remember about crisis intervention is that it's kind of parallel to emergency care or first aid. It's not mental health care or treatment. It's not counseling. It is a temporary, supportive entry into the situation of the individual, not into the event which caused the problem in the first place. So we are dealing with people when they are in a period of extreme distress to help them kind of access their own coping mechanisms or to recognize when mental health referral is necessary. But remember, crisis intervention is temporary, active, supportive, and the thing that's not in this slide is it's short term. If an individual requires longer term mental health intervention or support, then they should be referred to a mental health professional for that type of care. Now, some of you have already taken assisting individuals in crisis. Some of you will take it later. We want to remember here that when people are in groups, they are not treated like individuals. And when you're helping an individual, you are not treated as groups. And what this means is that we have different intervention procedures when we're working with an individual than those that we use when we're working with groups. And during the course of this program, we will discuss those in later modules. Now, most people are here to learn intervention techniques that they can use in their daily practice and or to get involved with a crisis intervention team. But let's give a little bit of a foundation as to how crisis intervention got where it is today and the kinds of environments and techniques that have been refined over time. So in the beginning, in the 1800s, early 1900s, procedures were used in an attempt to help people who were exposed to war and the horrors of war. And in the beginning, it was simple procedures like getting people away from the front, getting them out of the stimulus, giving them food, rest, fluids, the ability to talk to doctors, etc. When you look back, this is an attempt to help deal with the mental health impact of what the people and the soldiers were being exposed to. In World War I, Thomas Salmon looked at the ability to return psychologically traumatized individuals to the front after exposure to horrors of war and traumatic events, and found that 65% of the psychologically traumatized soldiers were able to return to the front in 3 to 4 days with some type of crisis intervention. Without any crisis intervention, only about 40% were able to return to combat, and it took about 3 to 4 weeks for people to be ready to do that. Why is this important? It's potential early indications that some kind of psychological intervention can be helpful in helping people to get through their emotional responses to very traumatic events. In the 1930s and 40s, we began to see the use of the term psychological first aid to be applied to techniques or methods that were being formalized in crisis intervention. So flash forward to the 1970s and 80s, and we started to see the development of a CISM program and some training through the work of Dr. Jeff Mitchell, who happens to be one of the co-founders of the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. But it wasn't until 2007 that the United Nations adopted CISM programs for employees worldwide. So as we flash forward and talk about peer intervention, we see in many professions that we have peers who are trained to provide critical incident support to individuals who are exposed to a critical incident and who are suffering critical incident stress. So as we've moved forward from the 90s to now, we've seen crisis intervention programs in a number of professions, including athletic training, beginning in 2016. So when we're providing crisis intervention, our goals are to reduce the emotional tension that the individuals are suffering. We want to get the people stabilized. We want to get them in a safe, stable mindset and physical situation. We want to help them mobilize personal resources. We want to help them process and mitigate the psychological impact of the event to which they've been exposed. We want to help educate them that their responses and their reactions are normal for the situation, and that individuals who suffer these kind of events have reactions similar to what you are experiencing, and we will help them identify their recovery processes. We will help to restore individuals to adaptive function. In other words, sometimes it's as simple as just helping the person mobilize and access their own coping mechanisms. When we have a unit of people or a group of people, we want to help the unit bond together, help them cope together with what's going on, with their responses, and we want to help them work back to good, strong unit performance. And then we want to identify people who may need professional assistance. It's very important that if someone is in a psychological crisis where they may be in a danger situation, that they get referred to the appropriate mental health support. So when providing crisis interventions, you want to remember a few things. Keep it simple. Remember, people are mentally and psychologically challenged at the time you're there. Don't make it complicated. They probably won't understand what you're telling them. Keep it brief. The intervention only needs to be long enough to meet the goals of the intervention. We'll talk about different intervention types, and you'll see that some are longer than others. Be innovative. Allow yourself to adapt to the situation, but be pragmatic. What you're doing has to be relevant to the situation that you're in. If it's not, that's a problem. So, there's three things that really work pretty well. Proximity. The research has shown that interventions close to the area where the traumatic event took place are often very effective. So you want to do it near or in the general area of where the situation is taking place. Immediacy. You want to get to people as soon as it's appropriate to do so. Certain interventions should take place within 24 to 48 hours of the incident. Other types of intervention models or tools would be used a little bit later. And when getting involved with a crisis intervention team, something like AT's Care, the team will educate the individuals participating as to how we do things, why we do things, and how the time frame works. But it's important to remember that sooner is often better. And expectancy is we want to be able to have the people receiving the intervention know what to expect in their reactions, know what to expect in a potential timeline, and use that expectancy to prepare them to access their coping skills. So in general, we have 8 basic steps for crisis intervention. You introduce the intervention and yourselves and the team, why you're here, what we're doing, etc., etc. We then do an assessment of the situation and its impact on the individual or individuals with whom we are providing an intervention. We then want to list all the potential options of what nature of intervention is appropriate for this individual or group at this point in time. We pick the best option. Now we're going to see as we study group crisis intervention that there's everything from information-only sessions to diffusings to debriefings. And the length of those and what happens in the nature of discussion is different. So we need to choose the best option for this group at this point in time after this situation. Then we want to implement the option we choose at that time, and we want to do it as soon as possible. You need to have individuals on your team who are reassessing the situation and reassessing the people for whom the intervention is being provided. After the reassessment, you want to decide whether you should maintain what you're doing, change what you're doing, or abandon this particular intervention option. And then when the time is appropriate, crisis intervention is closed. And that needs to be done in some sort of semi-formal or formal way, providing information to the participants receiving the intervention about their options. But note, if someone indicates that they are suicidal or that they may in fact harm someone else or they intend to harm someone else, a referral to a mental health professional is necessary. It's not an option. We don't leave people who indicate that they may be suicidal by themselves. So, critical incident stress management, CISM, is a systematic, multi-component system of support for individuals who are suffering critical incident stress. So, CISM programs, and CISM by its nature is very comprehensive. It looks at the whole nature of responses for different situations. It's integrative, which means that it involves multiple techniques, multiple strategies, multiple levels of professionals, from MDs who are psychiatrists and who are mental health specialists to counselors and psychologists to lay critical incident stress management providers. It's systematic. There's a structure, there's a way things are done, because we have found that certain techniques and certain ways of doing things are effective. And it is multi-component. It's not just one thing. It may be an educational component. There may also be an individual set of support mechanisms and different group mechanisms and mental health professionals, etc., etc., etc. But critical incident stress management, an appropriate program, has multiple components to it with trained individuals to deliver those components. I know it may sound like I'm beating this horse, but critical incident stress management is an organized approach. It contains a package of techniques. It's not just one thing. It's a subset of the whole world of crisis intervention, and it uses information from history, developed theory, practices, establishing goals, selecting appropriate techniques. It's important that the individuals providing critical incident intervention, either to individuals or groups, be appropriately trained to do so. So as we move forward in this course, we want to keep some things in mind. We want to triage and assess the situation, the nature of the problem, and the individuals who need to receive crisis intervention or support in this situation. We want good listening skills. Now, SAFER-R refers to a model that is used in individual crisis intervention. So when dealing with individuals, you want someone who's trained in individuals so that they have the appropriate tools and techniques to conduct the intervention. We want to be able to strategically assess and then plan for interventions, especially in medium to large scale events, because there could be the need for multiple interventions with different types of groups of individuals. And so that planning has to be addressed for everything from location to time frame to who's going to deliver the intervention. We have informational group processes, which we will talk about. We have interactive group processes, which we will talk about. And then we also need to touch on personal and community resistance, resilience, and recovery. In other words, how do you prepare yourself in the event that something happens? How do you access the ability to bounce back? And then what are the tools that are used for long-term recovery? Now, I put this slide in because I want to point out that the term critical incident stress debriefing, or the term debriefing, is commonly misused in the current world of critical incident stress management. And also when talking about certain pre-existing research, the term debriefing or the method debriefing has been used inappropriately to make conclusions about the effectiveness of CISM. The debriefing is one tactic or one intervention technique. It is not synonymous with CISM. Remember, CISM is a multi-component organized system. Critical incident stress debriefings are only used with homogeneous groups, and we'll talk about what is a homogeneous group later. It's an interactive process. There is a 7-step model which we will cover in detail and which we will practice. So remember, debriefing is only one of the tools in a comprehensive critical incident stress management system. This is the end of section 1. Thank you for listening. Now it's time to take a break, and when you're ready, move on to section 2.